Hello friends, how do you do? I think today's March 14th, 2020. Today's video is going to feature a bunch of animations I've made over the past couple weeks. They're loops I made to put on Instagram and Twitter for fun, and I thought some people might find it interesting if I broke down all the methods I used. If you're interested in getting into animation, you don't know where to start, maybe some of these methods will help open idea gateways for you. First, I will talk about all the programs I use in my workflow, and then I'll get to breaking down all the videos. And I hope you enjoy it, because it took a long time. These are the programs I use the most when it comes to animating things. The first two, they are 2D image programs. First we have GIMP, which is freeware, and it is fantastic. It is current. The second is PaintShop Pro. Now I'm sure PaintShop Pro has gone much further than 5 now, but this is the version I got 20 years ago, and I still use it, and it still does exactly what I needed it to do. Now Blender is a 3D environment program. This is also freeware. Thank goodness for that. Very powerful. It may not be the easiest to learn, but once you know how to do things, it is fantastic. It is free. It is wonderful. The fourth is Flash. Now Flash is an old program that people used to make animations and banner ads with. I think it's outdated now. I think people have moved on to After Effects, but I still use the old Flash to animate because I know how to use it so well. It's multi-layer. You can manipulate every single layer. I love it. Next we have the Fruity Loop Studio. They keep updating this faster than I can learn it, but I've been using this program for about 20 years as well, and it's come leaps and bounds, but this is a great sequencing program. You can also plug in instruments. You can manipulate every aspect of every note. It is wonderful. The next is SoundForge. I've also used this program for about 20 years. This is good for taking full chunks of audio and stretching it, putting effects on it, cutting into little pieces, putting it back together again. The last program on this list is Format Factory, and what this does is it converts formats to different formats. Some things look better on different platforms, and this helps you do it. It is freeware, but you know what they say about things that are free sometimes, so use at your own risk. Okay, on to the animations. This first one is just a swinging panel back and forth. This was done completely in Blender, except for the image editing. I dirtied up that piece of machinery in PaintShop. If you're interested in learning Blender, making 2D images 3D, especially things with a lot of blocky parts, is a good way to start. You subdivide the entire image into these blocks, and then you go and select the images and just pull the parts you want forward, and it makes this cool effect. I really like messing with control panels. Our next image here is our friend, and she's being surrounded by beans. I picked the initial images I wanted in the piece, and this was only 3 images. The next step, I had to mask out the part of the woman that I wanted to use, and then I needed to extend the beans, so I copied it twice and then edited out the beans by hand. I learned an easier way to do this down the road. I initially tried to do this in Blender first, but I didn't like the way that the shadows looked, and I didn't want to fiddle with the controls at the time to learn how to make them look better. So I knew how to do it in Flash. So I took it back into Flash, and how I did it was this. I took 1 can of beans, and that half circle you see there is a motion path. And I created a motion path for the 1 can of beans. I then duplicated the motion path until she was surrounded by cans of beans. So that's what I'm doing here. After our friend was surrounded by these beans, you edit the start frame of the animation, so it's slightly staggered, and then that gives you the effect. Pretty neat, huh? I have a few more here that used similar methods to that, so I'm just grouping them together. I think someone on Twitter thought I was trying to make some kind of political statement with this, but I just like BioShock. I'm very fond of machinery and trying to make 2D images of machinery work. So I thought I'd make a finger slicey thing. This is also on a motion path, and the shadows down below are also just circular things that are on a similar motion path that makes it look like it's putting a shadow in. And these are just masked cans that have fruits falling in and out. That's all hand animated. I thought it was neat. Alright, after I wet my beak on some simpler things, I decided to move on to some more complex things, like this bowl here. My first step was to gather up all of the things that I wanted to put in my bowl. I then brought them all into Flash. I masked them all so they would look good. And then I plopped them into my bowl layer by layer. And there are a few things that I added, like right here, the part that I'm circling, that is where a few drops of blood spew out. And again, I did that for the leaky egg to just add a little bit more fun in there. But the rest are just solid objects that I manipulated to fall into the bowl in a neat way. And I added some sound effects, and that was pretty fun. Alright, these are a few shots from a film I made back in 2005 called Alert. It's available on YouTube, free to watch if you like. During the creation of this film, I tried to make everything as different looking as I could, and I really used the rotation and alpha and scale and free transform tools a lot. But now that 3D is readily available, it is time to try to capture those a little bit more, because there's only so many things going around in a circle you can watch before you start to get sick. The next 3 animations I made, they used this method. This first image, I did 3, the theme being ladies with fruit in the middle. The first one was just this singular image of this woman that I masked out in Flash. I then went and placed her in a circular pattern as even as I could, and then distributed it to layers and gave them all motion tweens at different speeds. I also added a shadow in the back to add a little panache. This second animation is also a single woman, but instead of just being an image that doesn't do anything, I noticed she had a skull in her hand, and I liked that, so I broke it up into 3 different images and then animated that so she tossed the skull up. Then when I put those layers together in a circle, I started each one of those animations at a different time, so when it started to loop around, it would be like a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and all the things would be in the air at a different time. And I thought that added a cool look. For the third and final Spinny Lady sequence, I took many different women and I put them all on different layers. The first layer had two women in a similar pose, so I staggered them. And then the next three are the same, but then I did a bunch of spinning heads around the edge. And if you can spin the animation inside of the graphic and then spin the entire thing around and it matches up. There are people who can explain that better than me. They're on YouTube. Well, this isn't a plug for my movie alert, but if you haven't seen it, it's available on YouTube for free. I've always really liked currency, stocks and bonds and things that have that kind of design in them. That carried over to the next animation. So I'm not really the type of guy to get political or anything, but this idea was birthed by a social media tweet that got me thinking about food stamps. I remember when I was a kid, I remember holding these, I remember the smell of them. Didn't eat them for very long, but it was very handy to have them, to get stuff like food. Anyway, this also made me think of generic foods. If you grew up in the 80s, I know they have generic foods now, and the design is a lot different. But they used to look like this, just like white packaging with black print on them. It also has a nice lady. The elements of this were finding a cool pose and then finding something for her to lean on, which was this grape drink mix. These are the other elements. You got food stamps and then the surface that she's standing on. Really, the only thing that moves in this animation is the background, and using Flash, I assembled a seamless texture using the grid of the food stamps and matched them up with the loop. This next animation has a couple of neat elements to it, but it also utilizes the generic food. I thought luncheon loaf was funny, and I thought I liked the way she looked, and I thought some Christmas lights would be nice. The thing about this one is that each of the elements, or at least the woman, is animated. The woman is 3 different images. I don't know if it's visible in the animation, but she blinks. So this is 3 different images that I created a graphic that is just timed, so she blinks every once in a while. The background itself is 2 versions of the same image. One is blurred and one is not blurred, and that's a Christmas tree, and I faded the alpha in and out. And these are the other 2 elements, just the luncheon loaf and the floor she's sitting on. And put all together, you add a little bit of shadow on the bottom, and looked pretty neat, man. This next sequence was created mostly in Blender, but then a little bit in Flash. So what you're looking at when you see this is you're looking at the view of the camera, and the camera is the frame, what is contained inside the frame. This image here, this is what is inside the frame in Blender. But if you go over to this view, you see that triangular thing pointed at the images. The images can be skewed in any direction you like and mutilated and turned however you like. But from straight on, you're seeing things warp all over the place. And that's another neat way to use 2D graphics in a 3D environment. After I completed that animation in Blender, I exported all of the frames of the animation into Flash, where I animated 2 wheat stalks to cover up her nips. For modesty. She didn't ask to be in my animation, but I appreciate her help. So this sequence here is cyclic, which means it loops. Like the other ones, everything's a loop. But I wanted to do a different type of motion. The elements of this animation are so. First, I put together my scary little collection of a meat grinder and ladies' legs and a steak with a face and a can of poppers on the back for fun. And then I animated that. That is one animation cycle of this. Then you take that animation, you put it onto a new layer, and then you animate it using a motion tween from the top of the frame to the bottom of the frame. Moving onward, you then copy this animation 3 times, equally spaced, and you do a full cycle of those animations. After that, you export all of the images you have there, and you really are only going to need a couple of these images. So you start by, you can look at the bottom where one part meets the end of the frame, and then you go through all the images until the next one meets the end of that frame. Out of 100 images, you may only need 30 of them, and then you can put those in a loop and add your music, and there is your cycle. This image was completely made in Flash. There are no 3D elements to it, it's just a flat image. These are all the elements that I used in this photo, and I hand drew in some chords. The thing that makes this image jump out is this. This is a view of the control pad in Flash, and if you look at the top, you can see the music that I use, and each one of those keyframes at the bottom signifies a piece of animation. So I matched up the music or the beats to the blinking of the lights, and that's how I did that. It's all in one place, it's very neat, and it ended up looking pretty cool, I think. So I try to stuff these things with as much visually interesting stuff as I can. I mean, why else do it? And this animation here is a throwback to the old BBS days, which some of you may remember, where dial-up was very slow and you had to wait a long time to get your images. There are a few different elements in this animation. The first one is the modem. I tried to do what I did on the previous one, is add the lights on the top in Flash, but it didn't look right. What I did was I copied them in PaintShop, and then I put them over different sequences in the modem to use the actual light in the photo. And then I cycled that as a graphic inside Flash, so that is the way that the modem itself would look. The images on the screen were each sequences of Salami's download, but I didn't have a filter to do this, so every single image I went and created a loading cycle for them. And this is all of the Salami images together. This is every frame of what's on the screen. This next sequence is just all of the different layers put together in the animation, from the bottom to the top. You got the modem there, and then the screen, some shadows, Mountain Dew and cigarettes, and then the images to go on the screen. I put a filter over it so it wouldn't be so bright, and there's our computer, and there we go. Here's our animation. This kitten was done with a similar method to the one before it, so I'm not going to explain the whole thing again and bore you with it. This was my attempt at doing one of those infinite images that keeps going into itself. I still haven't figured out how to do those very well. I've reached the limitations of what I could export from Blender and import into Flash with this, so I'm not going to explain it. I didn't really do it successfully. I mean, successful enough, but I didn't really like it. So right here we have a lump of stuff. This is rotating, and this is all done in Blender. I initially started with a pair of chicken legs, which I then cut around the edges and then duplicated it a couple of times in neat looking ways using the copy print texture tools in PaintShop. I then imported it into GIMP, which can do seamless textures. With this image above, you then wrap it around the shape you made in Blender, and it's seamless. Now this spinning ball of whatever it is looks very complex, but it was created very easily in Blender. They have these things in Blenders called modifiers. They're basically a bunch of things you can tweak back and forth that make giant differences in the shapes you're working on. The skin, that is the image that covers the shape you're making in Blender, is this pile of barbecue that I made. Now this black and white image I made, this is a bump map or a texture map. Oh, I don't know the exact wording of it, but the light parts are the highest and the black parts are the lowest, and the grayscales are the parts in between. And when you add these things together with a modifier, this one I used a displace modifier, you can decide how tweaked out you want the image to be. And this was a neat amount of tweakability for me. You slide some sliders and it changes the depth, and sometimes it overlaps things, and then you end up with a really neat image like this. And this was way easier to do than a lot of the other things I showed you on here. And it looks really neat too. Okay, we're getting to the end of our animations here, which is good because I'm having trouble talking. This is one of those old handheld Tiger games. I started with this image of Ninja Gaiden. I also picked a nice deli spread because I knew I wanted this handheld thing to have something to do with meat. I created a mask around the image where the graphics go on the controller, and then placed them all on top of each other, and then added some words and did a little bit of design work. And then, to create the game that you see inside it, I created this layout of deli meats, and I used the sepia filter in GIMP. I then imported that into Flash, where I created the animation of the little ship going around and around. And that was a loop. And I just had to make sure all of the things were the same length. So when I went back to make this, each of the wobbles and everything, I don't know if it was 250 frames or whatever, but everything in it had 250 frames. So when you went back to the beginning, you didn't notice the seam in the work so much. But yeah, I made this image 3D, and I really liked how this turned out, and people did too. So that was cool. This last image with the Radio Shack Tandy computer was done with a similar way of plopping the screen inside of the 3D image. So it's basically the same thing, but not as colorful. Well, pals, that's the end of that. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd like to thank my new Patreon patron, David, who has helped me reach my goal that I set when I first started Patreon. I just reached my goal a couple days ago. So thank you, David, and thank you to all of my Patreon patrons who are here. The better the Patreon page does, hopefully the better the content I can crank out. It's very handy for artists, not just me. So if there are other artists you like more than me and you want to support them, a lot of artists have Patreon pages. Check it out, and I'm sure they'd appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you don't get sick. Try not to get sick. Try hard not to get sick.